"Get out before I call the police," the restaurant manager yelled, slamming his hand against the counter, while little Grace hugged her teddy bear trembling. Sophie, only 7 years old, stepped forward, her voice shaking with fury. "We haven't eaten in 3 days. Why do you treat us like criminals?" The place fell silent, and in the back corner, a man in a dark coat slowly stood up. What happens next will surprise you. What would you do in their place? Snow swept through Boston that night, swirling through narrow streets and cutting exposed skin. The city sparkled with Christmas lights hanging from shop windows and lampposts. Yet for 3 little girls walking the sidewalks, the glow only made their hunger more visible. Sophie, the oldest by a few minutes, guided her sisters across the slippery pavement with her jaw clenched against the cold. Laya stayed close, eyes watching shadows and passing strangers, always alert. Grace, the youngest, clutched her worn teddy bear against her chest, whispering to it as if the frayed toy could calm her fears. Their shoes were soaked, their coats no match for the sharp New England air. They had walked for hours without a clear destination, only hoping that somewhere someone would show them kindness. When they turned a corner and saw the warm glow of a restaurant's neon sign flickering above the door, they quickened their pace. Inside, they could see people laughing over steaming plates, couples clinking coffee cups, families leaning over tables in easy conversation. The aroma of fried fish and buttered rolls drifted out every time the door opened. Grace stopped dead, her little stomach growling loudly. "It smells so good," she whispered with wide eyes. Sophie squeezed her hand and pulled her closer. "Let's just try," she said firmly, though she knew very well how it might end. Laya's lips pressed into a thin line. "What if they call the police like last time?" The word alone made all 3 shudder. Police meant being separated, scattered into foster homes, never seeing each other again. Sophie swallowed her fear and forced firmness into her voice. "We'll stay together. I won't let them separate us." The bell above the restaurant door chimed when they entered. The wave of heat hit them first, sharp and almost painful against their frozen skin. For a brief, fleeting second, it felt like entering another world. Red leather booths filled the place. Waitresses carried trays full of dishes. The hiss of a coffee machine filled the air. Grace's eyes opened with wonder, her fingers gripping her teddy bear. All 3 slid nervously into the booth closest to the door, their legs dangling without touching the floor. But the illusion didn't last. Conversations quieted. Forks stopped mid-air. A wave of whispers moved through the place as diners noticed the 3 girls with their torn coats and muddy shoes. Behind the counter, the manager set down a tray, his gaze narrowing as he watched them. Robert Hayes had worked at that restaurant for more than 2 decades, a man who prided himself on maintaining order in his small corner of the city. Compassion tugged at him slightly, but habit and policy rose faster. He walked toward the booth, crouching to their level, his voice low so others wouldn't hear. "Are you waiting for someone?" he asked. Sophie lifted her chin, trying to make her voice sound steady. "No, sir, we're just hungry. Please." Robert looked around the place, catching the stares of his customers, the unspoken judgment floating in the air. He sighed. "I'm sorry, but I can't serve unaccompanied minors. It's the policy." Grace's eyes filled with tears as she hugged her teddy bear tighter. Leia clenched her fists under the table, anger burning hot in her chest. Sophie tried again, her voice breaking. "We haven't eaten in 3 days. Couldn't we have something small?" Robert's expression hardened, though his voice softened slightly. "If you don't leave, I'll have to call the police." With that word, the triplets moved as one. They rushed out of the booth, hearts pounding with terror, and pushed through the door into the freezing night. The bell rang again, this time sharp and hollow. Outside, the city felt colder than ever. They hurried down the street, breath coming out in uneven clouds, their eyes looking back, as if flashing lights might appear at any moment. Sophie led them to an alley beside the restaurant, pressing them against the brick wall. Grace's cheeks glistened with tears. "Why doesn't anyone want us?" she whispered, her voice trembling in the night. Sophie pulled her close, though her own heart threatened to break. What the girls didn't notice was the man who had quietly risen from a booth in the far corner. Daniel Whitmore had watched the whole scene unfold, the hopeful steps through the restaurant door, the silent rejection, the panic when the word police sent them fleeing. He had been dining alone, dressed simply in dark jeans and a wool coat, with no trace of the vast fortune he commanded or the empire he had built from nothing in California years before. Tonight, he had chosen this small Boston restaurant to escape the weight of boardrooms and headlines. But fate had put something else in front of him. 3 trembling children, mirrors of a child he had once been. Daniel paid his bill quickly and went outside. The cold air cut against his face. Snow crunched under his boots as he followed the trail of small footprints toward the alley. He stopped at the edge, watching the sisters huddled together. Their coats were thin, their shoes soaked, their faces marked with hunger and fear. The sight reached inside him with a sharpness he hadn't felt in years. For a moment he said nothing, remembering what it was like to be young and desperate, to see every stranger as a potential threat. He knew that trust was something fragile, easily broken. So he kept his hands visible and his voice low, careful not to frighten them. "Hey," he said softly, taking a step forward. The girls turned with wide eyes, Sophie immediately moving in front of her sisters like a shield. Daniel offered a small, steady smile. "Don't be afraid. I saw what happened inside. I just want to help." Silence stretched between them, broken only by the wind curving through the alley. Grace's stomach growled again, and Sophie's eyes flickered uncertainly between her sisters and the stranger. Daniel's voice remained calm, almost pleading. "I know what it's like to be out here. I know how hunger feels. Someone once helped me when I thought no one would. Let me do the same for you." The triplets exchanged one of their silent looks, the kind only siblings could share. Fear remained in their eyes, but also the faintest spark of hope. Daniel kept a careful distance while the 3 sisters watched him, their small bodies tense against the frozen brick wall. Sophie stood firm in front, her thin shoulders squared, as if she could block out the cold and every threat in the world. Laya's dark eyes were narrowed with suspicion, scanning him the same way she had studied the restaurant before entering. Grace clung to her teddy bear, the fur matted and worn, her lips trembling as she pressed her face against it for courage. Daniel didn't move closer. He remembered how it felt to shrink back from every approaching adult, wondering if they were there to help or to take something away. "You don't have to run anymore," he said quietly, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "I know you don't know me, but I've been where you are." Sophie's jaw tightened. "No, you haven't." Her voice was small but defiant. "You're warm, you've eaten, you don't look like us." Daniel nodded slowly. "You're right. I don't look like this now, but when I was a child I was cold and hungry too. I slept on benches, hid in alleys, and prayed for someone to notice me." He let the words hang there, his gaze steady. The girls exchanged a quick glance, that unspoken conversation only siblings understood. Grace peeked out from her teddy bear, her voice barely audible. "What happened?" Daniel crouched down, slightly careful to keep space between them. "One night, someone decided to help me. She gave me food, a warm bed, and told me I could be more than what the world had convinced me to believe. Thanks to her, I had a chance to change my life." The triplets were silent, their eyes flickered with curiosity, but mistrust still wrapped around them like armor. Leia finally spoke, her tone sharper than her sister's. "Why us? Why now? People walk by all the time. Why would you stop?" Daniel's answer was simple. "Because I see myself in you, and because I promised myself that if I ever had the chance to do what was done for me, I wouldn't ignore it." The wind howled through the alley, rattling loose trash and numbing their fingers further. Grace shivered violently, pressing closer to Sophie. Daniel's voice softened. "Come back inside with me, not alone this time. I'll sit with you and no one will make you leave." Sophie's lips parted as if she wanted to believe him, but her fear clung stubbornly. "If you're lying, they'll call the police." Daniel shook his head. "If anyone tries, I'll be the one to answer them. And I give you my word, you won't be separated." The girls turned inward, their foreheads almost touching as they whispered urgently to each other. Leia's eyes kept returning to him, testing every flicker of his expression for weakness. Grace sobbed, her cheeks red from the cold. Finally Sophie turned toward him, her chin raised. "Do you promise?" The word came out with the weight of every broken promise they had endured. Daniel met her gaze without hesitation. "I promise." They didn't move immediately, but Sophie's grip on her sisters relaxed. Slowly, she took a step forward, still, keeping herself between them and the stranger. Daniel straightened, giving them space as he gestured toward the restaurant's bright windows. Together, they began walking back through the snow, their small footprints following his longer steps. Grace stumbled once, and without thinking, Daniel extended his hand. She hesitated, then slipped her little fingers into his. The simple act tugged at something deep within him, a memory of his own child's hand, desperately clutching at kindness. When they reached the door, the bell chimed again, startling the few customers who were still inside. Heads turned, whispers grew, and forks stopped mid-air as the sight settled. The well-dressed man who had been dining alone now escorting the 3 ragged children who had been thrown out moments before. Robert Hayes nearly dropped the tray he was carrying when he saw them. He set it down abruptly and approached quickly, adjusting his tie, his face pale with embarrassment. "Sir, I already explained to the girls." Daniel raised his hand gently, not confrontational, but authoritative enough to stop Robert mid-sentence. "We should talk privately," he said, in a tone that left no room for refusal. The manager blinked, then nodded quickly. "This way." Daniel turned to the girls. "You can sit in that booth over there. I'll be right back, and you can see me the whole time." Sophie hesitated, searching his face for any hint of betrayal. Grace tugged at his sleeve. "You'll come back." Leah didn't speak, but her watchful eyes followed him intently as all 3 slid into the booth. Daniel and Robert moved to a quieter corner. The manager fidgeted nervously, his hands restless. "Look, I have rules. I can't just—" Daniel interrupted calmly but firmly. "I understand the rules, but what I saw tonight were 3 hungry children begging for a meal. Do you know what their biggest fear is? Not hunger. But cold. It's being separated." His words hit Robert like a weight, and his eyes flickered toward the booth where the girls sat pressed tightly together. Daniel leaned closer. "I'm here now. I'll pay for their food. I'll take responsibility for them. All I need from you is to serve them with dignity." Robert swallowed hard, his resolve crumbling under the quiet authority in Daniel's voice. Of course, if you provide me with your identification." Daniel slid his wallet across the table. Robert looked at the card and froze. His eyes widened. "You're Daniel Whitmore." He had read the name in countless headlines, seen it printed under photographs of glass towers and global companies. Now that face was in front of him, humble but unshakable. Daniel nodded slightly. "Yes, but I would appreciate your discretion." Robert returned the wallet with trembling hands. "Of course, Mr. Whitmore. I'll take care of them." He walked away toward the kitchen, already signaling the staff. Daniel stood and returned to the booth where the girls were waiting. Grace's eyes lit up with relief when she saw him. Sophie relaxed almost imperceptibly. Even Leah, though still cautious, leaned forward as if ready to listen. A waitress arrived, carrying bowls of steaming soup, slices of fresh bread, and glasses of juice. The aroma filled the air, and the girls' stomachs growled in unison. Daniel sat across from them, his voice gentle. "Go slowly. When you've been without food, your body needs time to adjust. Trust me, I learned the hard way." They looked at him curiously, their spoons pausing. Leah finally asked, "Is it true that you were really like us?" Daniel nodded, breaking bread into smaller pieces for them. "Yes, I know what it means to be cold, hungry, and scared, and I know how much it matters when someone notices you. That's why I couldn't walk away tonight." Sophie looked at him, her eyes searching for cracks in his sincerity. Grace, her mouth full of warm bread, whispered, "Thank you." Leah still studied him cautiously, but said nothing more. While they ate, Daniel listened more than he spoke, asking gentle questions, letting the girls reveal pieces of themselves at their own pace. Their words were hesitant at first, fragments of fear and memory, but the warmth of the soup and the safety of his presence calmed them. For the first time in a long time, laughter slipped between them, small, uncertain, but real. Daniel leaned back, watching them, a silent vow forming in his chest. He had been given a chance once, and it had changed everything. Tonight, fate had given him 3 chances at once, and he wouldn't waste them. The city was quieter when Daniel guided the triplets toward his car. Snow had settled into a steady fall, covering Boston in white, softening the sounds of traffic and muting the hum of neon signs. Sophie hesitated when he opened the back door of the sleek black sedan, her arm extended protectively in front of Leia and Grace. The interior looked too polished, too unfamiliar, as if entering would erase the fragile courage she had managed to gather. Daniel crouched so his eyes were level with hers. "You'll all be together." "You have my word," he said softly. Something in the firmness of his tone, in the way he didn't push but simply waited, made Sophie finally nod. She helped Grace climb in first, then followed with Leia close behind. The drive out of the city was long, the bright lights of downtown giving way to quieter neighborhoods, and eventually to sprawling estates outside Cambridge. Grace fell asleep quickly, her teddy bear tucked under her chin, her small head resting against the window. Leia sat rigidly, her gaze fixed on the blur of trees and fences outside, every muscle still tense with suspicion. Sophie also stayed awake, her eyes on Daniel in the driver's seat. She said nothing, but he could feel her studying him, measuring every movement. He let the silence stretch, unwilling, to fill it with empty reassurances. Instead, he glanced at them in the mirror occasionally, his chest tightening at how small they looked against the wide leather seats. When they turned through tall wrought iron gates, the headlights illuminated a house that seemed to rise from the snow like a fairy tale mansion. Warm lights glowed from the 3-story house's windows, and frozen fountains mid-spray filled the front yard. Sophie's breath caught, and even Leia's sharp eyes widened for a moment. "Do you live here?" she asked, disbelief in her voice. "Yes," Daniel replied gently. "And now, for as long as you need, this is your home too." The front door opened before they even reached the steps. Margaret, the housekeeper who had worked with Daniel for more than a decade, was waiting, her gray hair pulled into a neat bun, her wrinkled face softened with warmth. She looked at the 3 children with an expression that was half shock, half instant concern. "Oh, the poor things," she murmured quickly, stepping aside to let them pass. The girls shuffled into the grand foyer, their muddy shoes leaving faint tracks on the marble floor. A crystal chandelier hung above them, and the space smelled faintly of pine and cinnamon. For the girls, it felt more like a museum than a place where someone could live. Grace rubbed her eyes, overwhelmed by the sheer size of everything, while Sophie's arm instinctively drew her sisters closer. Daniel touched Margaret's arm lightly. "Prepare one of the guest rooms, the pink one in the east wing, and maybe some warm clothes, something soft." Margaret nodded energetically, already moving toward the staircase. "Of course, Mr. Whitmore." Upstairs, the pink guest room glowed softly from a lamp beside a canopy bed, covered in satin sheets. It was bigger than the entire apartment the girls had once shared with their mother. Sophie helped Grace climb onto the mattress, while Leia cautiously ran her hand over the silk curtains, as if she was sure they weren't real. Margaret returned with fluffy pajamas, slightly big but Ian and warm. She filled a clawfoot tub with steaming water, bubbles spilling over the sides. At first, Sophie tried to undress her sisters herself, unwilling to let anyone else care for them, but Margaret's gentle patience slowly relaxed her grip. The girls sank into the water with wide eyes, laughing at the foam that stuck to their skin, their laughter echoing through the tiled bathroom. Daniel stood in the doorway, watching them rediscover the simple joy of warmth and soap. Something in his chest tightened as he remembered his own first bath after weeks on the streets. A small act of kindness that had felt like salvation. He closed the door softly, giving them privacy, and retreated to his study. The room was filled with bookshelves, maps, and awards, but Daniel's attention was fixed on his laptop. Years of building his company had given him access to networks and resources most could never imagine. With a few keystrokes, he began searching for any records of the girls, birth certificates, school enrollments, medical files. Their story weighed on him, not just for the hunger he had witnessed, but for the fear in their eyes every time police were mentioned. They were running from something, and he needed to know what. By the time Margaret brought the girls back downstairs, dressed in clean pajamas and smelling faintly of lavender, Daniel had found nothing more than fragments. It was as if their lives had been deliberately hidden. He rose from his desk when the triplets entered the room, walking on tiptoes. Grace carried her teddy bear, now freshly washed, her wet hair curling around her face. Sophie kept her sisters close, but her posture was less rigid, exhaustion softening her sharp edges. Leia scanned the room, eyes moving from the shelves to the fireplace before finally resting on him. Margaret set down a tray of sandwiches and warm milk. "Eat, little ones," she insisted. The girls obeyed cautiously at first, nibbling the food, then devouring it when hunger overcame hesitation. Daniel sat nearby, not eating, simply watching them. Their small voices began to fill the silence, fragments of stories about their mother slipping out between bites, how she used to braid their hair in different styles every morning, how she sang them to sleep even when she was tired. Sophie's voice broke when she spoke of their mother's smile, and Daniel's chest tightened at the pain in her. When the food was gone and yawns came more frequently, Margaret guided them back upstairs to bed. The triplets climbed onto the wide mattress together, curving against each other instinctively. Sophie in the middle, her sisters pressed close on each side. Grace whispered to her teddy bear, her eyelids already heavy. Leia fought sleep longer, her watchful eyes still on the door, until finally even she fell asleep. Sophie stayed awake longest, staring at the ceiling, one hand extended to touch both sisters as if to anchor them in place. Daniel stood quietly in the doorway, watching them breathe in unison. The sight tugged at memories he rarely allowed himself to revisit. His own nights, huddled in fear, the desperation of clinging to the only family he had left. He made a silent vow then, not just to keep them fed and warm, but to keep them together, no matter what it required. Back in his study, firelight flickered across his face as he picked up his phone. He dialed a number he hadn't used in years. "Charles," he said when the line connected. "This is Daniel Whitmore. I need your services. 3 children. Their mother is gone. Their stepfather. I don't trust the story. Find everything. Records, neighbors, history. I want to know who these girls are and what they've been running from." He hung up, leaning back in his chair, staring at the flames. Upstairs, 3 small figures finally slept in safety, but Daniel knew that safety was fragile, and shadows from the past had a way of reaching even the brightest homes. The first week, at Daniel's estate passed like a blur for the triplets. The warmth of regular meals and the rhythm of safe sleep slowly began to soften their rigid vigilance. Grace discovered the library and clung to picture books with the same devotion she had once given her teddy bear. Leia, still cautious, stayed near windows and doors, her eyes sharp and calculating, as if she expected someone to storm the gates. Sophie carried herself like a guardian, even here, watching over her sisters before allowing herself to explore the grand garden or the pink room they all insisted on sharing. But safety didn't erase the shadows that followed them. Daniel's investigator, Charles, was quick. By the end of the week, he sat across from Daniel in the study, a thick folder between them. "Her name was Rachel Carter," Charles began. "She died 2 months ago, acute leukemia, 32 years old." Daniel's chest tightened at the sound of the name. He said nothing, just gestured for Charles to continue. "The girls' birth certificates don't list a father. Rachel raised them alone until she married Thomas Weber 2 years ago. Neighbors describe him as volatile, especially after Rachel's death. Drinking, fighting, possible abuse. They ran because they feared being separated, and frankly, they were right." Daniel's hand slowly curled into a fist. He thought of the bruises neighbors mentioned, the way Sophie's body always tensed at the word police, the way Grace shrank from raised voices. The truth burned through him. Not just anger toward Weber, but grief for a woman who had carried the weight of 3 children alone, only to leave them in the hands of a man unworthy of them. That night, after the girls had been tucked into bed, Sophie quietly walked to Daniel's study, clutching a small box with tape peeling at the corners. "We kept it hidden," she whispered, placing it on his desk. Inside were small treasures, ribbons, folded notes, and a woman's neat handwriting, a faded photograph. Daniel lifted the photo carefully, his breath catching. It showed Rachel on a park bench in a blue dress, her long hair loose in the summer breeze. Beside her sat a younger version of himself, smiling at her with an expression he hadn't worn in years. For a long moment he couldn't breathe. Memories unspooled, sharp and relentless. Mornings at a small cafe where she worked while studying at university, the way she slipped him the best piece of pie because she said he looked tired, the late nights they spent hunched over his first business proposal. She had been his first love, the one who believed in him when all he had was ambition and an empty wallet. And then one day she disappeared. No note, no explanation. He had searched, but she had vanished without a trace. Now here was the answer, staring at him in the form of 3 children who carried his eyes. His hand trembled as he set the photograph down. Sophie watched him carefully, her young face solemn. "Did you know our mom?" she asked. He forced his voice steady. "Yes. Long ago she was extraordinary." Grace, who had entered silently with Leia behind her, whispered, "She never told us about you." Daniel nodded slowly, his throat tight. "I think she wanted to protect you, and maybe protect me too." The girls moved closer, their eyes wide with curiosity and confusion. Hope. Leia's voice was sharper, demanding, "Then why didn't you find us before?" Daniel met her gaze without blinking. "Because I didn't know you existed. If I had known, nothing could have kept me away." The silence that followed was thick with unspoken pain. Sophie finally broke it, placing her small hand over his. "We believe you." The next day, Charles returned with more news. Rachel's mother, Sarah Carter, was alive, living in a nursing home on the outskirts of the city. She had never met her granddaughters. For reasons still hidden, Rachel had cut her off completely years back. Daniel took the girls there, their hands gripped firmly in his as they entered the modest facility. When Sarah looked up from her chair and saw them, her face broke with disbelief. The triplets froze in the doorway, 3 echoes of her daughter at different ages. But when her gaze moved to Daniel, tears spilled down her cheeks. "You," she whispered, voice trembling. He nodded, his own throat constricted. In that small room filled with the scent of roses and old books, the past crashed against the present. The woman who had once saved a desperate child from the streets was now the grandmother of the children he had vowed to protect. It wasn't coincidence, not random twist of fate. The threads of their lives had been woven together long before this night, and the truth left them all trembling, bound by grief, memory, and the fragile hope of family reborn. The court's decision ended months of tension. When the judge's words confirmed that Daniel Whitmore would become the legal guardian of Sophie, Leia, and Grace, the 3 sisters clung to him with desperation that melted into relief. It wasn't just a legal decision, it was a new beginning, a moment that turned fear into permanence. Sophie whispered, almost as if she was afraid the words might vanish into air. "They'll never take us away again?" Daniel drew all 3 girls into his arms and said with quiet certainty, "Never. You're safe now. You're home." In the weeks that followed, the house settled into a rhythm that felt natural, almost as if it had been waiting for them all along. Mornings were filled with the sound of cereal bowls and Grace's laughter floating through the hallways. Afternoons found Leia on the library floor, sprawled with astronomy books, her sharp mind expanding in ways no one had nurtured before. Sophie followed Margaret around the kitchen, watching how bread was kneaded or soup was seasoned, eager to learn skills that made her feel capable of caring for others. Evenings ended with all 3 squeezed into the pink room, whispering secrets and laughter until they fell asleep, their hands always reaching for each other in the darkness. Sarah Carter had grown stronger since leaving the retirement home and moving into a small cottage Daniel built for her on the estate grounds. She spent hours with the girls sharing stories about Rachel, how she once organized puppet shows for neighborhood children, how she saved coins to buy books instead of dresses, how her stubborn streak made her both exasperating and extraordinary. For the triplets, these stories filled in the pieces of a mother they remembered only in fragments, giving them roots they had thought were lost. For Sarah, it was a second chance at motherhood, one she embraced with tenderness. Daniel, for his part, carried the weight of both memory and promise. In the evenings, after the house had grown silent, he looked at the photograph Sophie had placed in his hands, the image of a young Rachel beside his younger self. It awakened both pain and gratitude. Pain for what was lost, but gratitude for what was found. 3 lives entrusted to him, and a family he never imagined he would have. It was during one of those nights that the idea for the foundation was born. Daniel knew that wealth could build skyscrapers and companies, but it was powerless if it didn't heal wounds like the ones Sophie, Leah, and Grace had carried. Standing in the same place where his life had been changed, he announced the creation of the Rachel Carter Foundation. Its mission was straightforward: provide shelter, education, and protection for children facing hunger, neglect, or the threat of separation. No child, Daniel declared, his voice firm but filled with emotion, should feel invisible. No sibling should fear being separated. We'll make sure of that. The triplets stood beside him as he spoke, their small hands gripping his. Sophie looked at the crowd, her posture already protective of her sisters. Leah, always the skeptic, scanned the faces of strangers, but kept her chin high, her confidence growing. Grace simply leaned into Daniel's side, eyes bright, as if she believed every word would change the world. The audience, moved by the sincerity of the moment, rose in applause. As the foundation began its work, its impact spread rapidly. Homes opened for children with no safe place to go. Scholarships were provided for those whose potential had been buried under hardship. At every event, Daniel brought the girls with him, not as tokens, but as proof of resilience. "We know how it feels to be hungry," Leah once said in her clear, unwavering voice. "And we know how it feels when someone doesn't give up on you." Her words reached deeper than polished speeches ever could. At home, the life they built together deepened with ordinary joys. Sunday pancakes became a ritual with Sophie, insisting on flipping the first one, even if it came out lopsided. Sarah read bedtime stories in the soft lamplight, her voice trembling sometimes with memory, but steady with love. Grace filled the garden with drawings taped to sticks, waving like small flags of hope. Daniel tucked them into bed each night, listening as their whispered prayers grew less about fear and more about gratitude. One summer evening, as dusk painted the sky, Daniel stood by the garden, watching the 3 sisters chase each other among the roses Sarah had planted. Their laughter carried on the warm air, mixing with the sound of Sarah's rocking chair creaking softly on the porch. The weight of his past, the loneliness of his empire, seemed to dissolve in that sound. He thought of the child he had once been, cold, hungry, invisible, and of the woman who had offered him kindness when no one else had. That kindness had me full circle, leading him to this moment, where 3 little girls had transformed his life as much as he had transformed theirs. Legacies, Daniel realized, weren't measured by wealth or monuments. They were measured by promises kept, by lives restored, by love given freely. Rachel's story hadn't ended with loss. It lived on in Sophie's determination, in Leah's fierce intellect, in Grace's boundless heart. And through them, through the foundation that bore her name, it would continue rippling outward, touching lives far beyond their own. As the stars emerged over the estate, Sophie ran toward him, her sisters close behind, their cheeks flushed from play. "Dad," she said, slipping her hand into his. "We're happy." Daniel looked down at them, his heart full. "Me too," he whispered, knowing that everything he had once yearned for he had found, not in boardrooms or contracts, but here in the unbreakable bond of a family built by fate and sealed by love. On a freezing night in Boston, 3 little sisters, shivering with hunger, were thrown out of a restaurant, denied even a scrap of food. That moment of rejection could have been the end of their story. Instead, it became the beginning. When Daniel Whitmore, a billionaire who had once known hunger himself, chose to follow them, the lives of Sophie, Leah, and Grace changed forever. What began as an act of kindness became a journey of protection, healing, and discovery, a path that revealed lost family ties, long-buried love, and the unbreakable strength of compassion. The triplets, once terrified of being separated, found safety not just in a house of marble and light, but in the heart of a man who kept his promises. Sarah, the grandmother they had never known, became a source of stories, warmth, and belonging, and through the Rachel Carter Foundation, their mother's memory was honored, ensuring that countless other children would never face the same fear and hunger alone. This story isn't just about the unlikely bond between a billionaire and three homeless girls. It's about the power of one decision, a decision to notice the invisible, to act when it would be easier to walk away, to give when the world expects you to stay silent. Daniel's choice reminds us that legacies aren't built by wealth or power, but by the lives we touch, the promises we keep, and the courage to love when it costs us something. In our lives today, we may not be in Daniel's shoes, but we encounter people every day who carry invisible burdens. A kind word, an open hand, a willingness to listen. These small acts can be the turning points in someone else's story. We never know when our compassion might become the very thing that saves a life. If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments and let us know what lesson you take from it. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your support gives us the strength to create more stories that inspire, heal, and remind us of the extraordinary power of kindness.